okay, you've been here 3 years, now you're a senior, or you've been here 5 years, now you're three. And I remember having conversations around that and saying, okay, but are they really performing better? Or do they really deserve that promotion? Yes, you can be doing something for 3 years, but it doesn't mean you're doing it better.
As president of Exemplary Performance, Jamie Torchiana is here with us today. She amplifies individual talent and drives high-performing teams to greater organizational success by replicating the accomplishments of a client's highest performers. She believes that everyone has a purpose in life, a unique talent to give others that spark from the soul. Her work is her passion, from increased sales, more engaged and effective employees, to acknowledgement and removal of barriers that are unintentionally inhibiting your team's performance. Jamie loves helping her clients win. So thank you, Jamie, for having us today, or joining us today. And as Vice President of Operations for Radcom, Therese Longo is a certified performance thinking practitioner and has more than 15 years of experience in instructional design. She leads the development of Radcom's project teams, helping to produce customized documentation, training, and other support that helps clients enhance their professional abilities. Therese also works with company executives, managing various projects where she helps clients set and achieve organizational goals. So thank you both for joining us today. We're really excited about what we're going to be talking about today, career path design for optimal performance. And the thing that excites me the most about this whole idea of performance-based thinking and how we go about it this way is the fact that it doesn't matter what size company you're in, what size organization you're in, whether you're nonprofit, for-profit, big or small, it really doesn't matter. So I'd love for you ladies to share some of your own experiences. I know we got a couple of case studies we'd like to talk through, but just share a little bit about the client that you want to talk through and kind of how career pathing has kind of gotten in their story. Jamie, you want to start?
Sure, happy to. So we've done this across a variety of industries and all types and sizes. The one we're going to focus on today primarily is a biopharmaceutical client of ours that's headquartered in the Midwest and had about 1,900 employees. So small, they specialized in rare and rheumatic diseases, again in the biopharmaceutical space. And really the project sponsor was interested in using excellence as a strategy. So he founded a commercial training and development department within this organization. Historically, sales trainers would sit within the lines of business or the therapeutic area, and he wanted to wrangle some efficiencies and bring everyone together under one commercial training and development kind of umbrella to maximize some efficiencies. This company, just in December, was touted as Fortune 100's fastest growing biopharmaceutical. So certainly all eyes were on their organization, and we looked at 6 roles within commercial training and development: the executive director, the senior director, associate director, director, senior training manager, and training manager. So that's just a little bit of a clue of what's happening with role clarity that I know we'll get to later on in this webinar, but that's a quick snapshot of our client who's located in the Midwest, just outside of Chicago.
Great. Yeah. So certainly on the larger scale and different varieties of positions there. Therese, you want to share a little bit about yours?
Sure. So the company that we're working with, focusing on today, is a biomechanical and injury causation consulting company. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but basically what they do is they're the people that go into court and testify when there's an accident. So the engineers and medical doctors that do all the analysis and then present and testify at trials. That's what they do. Super, really interesting content to be working with. They're located in Texas, and they're a smaller company, about 80 employees. And there were about 10 employees in the engineering group that we were working with. So the CEO, who also was the manager of the engineering department, a small company, right? So she wanted to look at what career paths were available. They started with 5 roles. There was an engineer 1, 2, and 3, and also a technical director and an assistant technical director. And we ended up blowing that out into about 8 roles that you'll see later when I go into our approach. But they were having a lot of complaints by their employees about wanting developmental opportunities that were just not there. And a lot of times in smaller companies, those are the things that just you don't get to, So she was making a great effort to get something established for this particular group and was hoping to do it with the whole company,
Great. So just a quick aside, I wanted to read a couple of things that folks we asked, what you hope to learn out of today, and career pathing obviously was coming in there. And one of the things in particular, so as we get in, how do you start was one of the questions, and what things should be considered. I think we'll talk a lot about that as we get in here. And again, having a couple different size variations, I think will help. And some others said, they're interested in how others are addressing career paths and how that's working. So I'm going to toss it back to you, Therese, and ask the question, just kind of some of the specific kind of unique business challenges or opportunities that your client was facing when you got started with them.
Sure. So I think, this was a client that we were already doing some training for them. And the CEO and their HR department, they were trying to do it themselves. They had pulled together this huge Excel spreadsheet that was focused on work activities, so behaviors. It wasn't even consistent. It was like work activities, and then sometimes it would just say a software application that they might use. And then they had each of the roles, and they were trying to rate them and see, at what levels do they need to be skillful in these areas. So, but I think what happened is once they got that done, they didn't know what to do with it. So they asked, if we could do that for them. And that's when we, said we could approach it from a performance standpoint. So I think the other part of it was they were working with someone who was working on their org chart, and they're trying to add some middle management in there and want to make sure that they set up that new director for success and being able to work with this team in a productive way.
Awesome. Jamie?
So similar, and even though it's different industries, sometimes the problems they emerge, we're all struggling with the same things. And I think that that's a tenet that's going to come through this webinar pretty clearly. And we're going to start in the same direction too. But before you get there, my client certainly had some struggles, and I bucket them kind of in 4 primary areas. First, there was no definition or standard for roles or titles. As I mentioned, the trainers used to sit within the lines of business. So if someone excelled at a national sales meeting and leaders saw that person on stage and they were great for an hour, you might get a promotion or increased job responsibilities. And that was kind of willy-nilly and ad hoc across the organization. So they also wanted to align, I think of what we talk about as a performance-based approach, or we call it role excellence profiling, just benchmarking what the best do. That is like a Christmas tree on which ornaments such as job description, hiring guide, interview guides, coaching guides, performance review, all of those ornaments should hang based upon using excellence as a structure. So this client asked me, we have job descriptions for the same role that look as though they're written by 7 different people. So we need to standardize and align job descriptions so that when you come into the department, you know what accountabilities you have. You're evaluated against that, and that's the basis for promotion. So thirdly, it made conversations about coaching and promotion very challenging because there was no standard. There was no role degradation as to what separates me from a training manager and a senior training manager. At the organization, when we started our partnership, it was tenure-based. So if you went around the Monopoly board once or a lap around the sun, you automatically clicked go from training manager to senior training manager with no knowledge of your value of contribution to the organization. So it wasn't performance-based, it was tenure-based, and that sets up kind of some crunchy morale things. And just, if you're a people manager, you're ill-equipped to have those coaching conversations on what great looks like and how you can prep people for role succession and talent management. So I think all of that in their quest to attract and retain the top talent. Remember, they were Fortune 100's fastest growing biopharmaceutical company. They wanted to do that. They needed to align some of these ancillary factors that are all hinged on what the best do. So those were some clear challenges that we stepped right into. And I know Therese shares this. We solve those gnarly problems. It's what we love to do.
Right. So I want to ask a quick question to the audience, does this sound familiar? So some of the challenges that Jamie and Therese just shared, I'm going to ask you just real simple, throw a 1 in the chat if yes, it sounds familiar and you think that that's a typical struggle, and a 2 if there's something else that's going on in your world and maybe we could talk a little bit different. But 1s to say yes, you agree, you're right in there, same challenges, and 2s if you're not. Looks like we got some 1s coming in. So yes, you're, like you said, you're not alone for sure. So how was the particular organization that you're working with, how was this problem kind of impacting these respectively? Kind of, what was we talked about the problems, but what challenges were those creating? I'll go to you, Therese.
And I think Jamie addressed a little bit of it in what she said previously, and that was, for my organization, it was a lack of timely promotions. There were no clear career paths, and there were a lot of people in the department that each had little specializations because they could be specialized in different things. So there was no real structure to who was doing what and why. It wasn't deliberate. It was just, who's available? Okay, I'm going to do that. Or we need someone to learn this so we can do this case. So I think there was just a lack of structure, first of all. And then secondly, I think there were people in the organization that had reached the top level. They were a level 3 engineer, and they had nowhere to go because that's all they had was level 3. But they still wanted to grow. So, a great book I just read, Promotions Are So Yesterday, gives some great examples of ways that you can help people grow in their career, even if they're not moving up a ladder. So that's some of the things that we're going to include in our program when we start getting into the other deliverables. But I think, they didn't have any clear paths. They didn't also have a good way to promote. Like Jamie said earlier, it was just, okay, you've been here 3 years, now you're a senior. Or, you've been here 5 years, now you're 3. And I remember having conversations around that and saying, okay, but are they really performing better? Or do they really deserve that promotion? Yes, you can be doing something for 3 years, but it doesn't mean you're doing it better. And so I think there were a lot of aha moments in those meetings where they really grasped the idea of having it be more performance-based and looking at the outputs of what people were delivering and what the standards of those were. And so I think there was a lot of aha moments for them and thinking through like how they could be doing this different.
Yeah, I think, and we'll get to it, I think, in future pieces here. But I think one of the things that I think the assumption is that a promotion or a next step in the ladder is an upward thing. And I think some people don't necessarily think about the fact that there are some horizontal or maybe diagonally up or something like that, where I may be in this role, but I actually, in my dream, I'd love to be over here somewhere, so I think just considering those other options.
Right. And I think in this department of engineers, they like the work they're doing. A lot of them don't want to be managers, or they may not want to be experts who have to go testify in court. Maybe that makes them nervous or whatever. So ways for them to specialize and grow their expertise in a different way was one thing that we really were able to help them with.
And Jamie, how about you?
Yeah, before I share, because there are some similar golden threads here, Matt, to your point, we call it a lattice, not necessarily a ladder. So what can you get laterally that's experienced? If you're a sales manager, can you get some analytics and some deep insights or some marketing that would be a lateral on your paycheck or pay band, but it really increases kind of your depth and breadth and knowledge of the organization. So we use that. Too often it was the career ladder, but we mention lattice just for this very purpose of this conversation. So yeah, we mentioned the challenges that this organization was having, but how was it affecting them? How was it showing up? So certainly lack of role clarity impacted morale. And there were redundant job activities. When you don't have a job description, you have folks with great intentions jumping into what needs to be done. But again, without any structure, it became, there were some redundancies that we uncovered. Also, we mentioned the lack of clarity or insight on what's needed for promotion made it hard to have those coaching conversations. And in speaking with the CHRO of this organization, she admitted that in order to attract and retain top talent, they were artificially inflating job titles and salaries. So what this meant was there was no parity within the biopharmaceutical industry. So if she wanted to attract a director, you had a director coming in and leading a classroom training, which typically in our industry would be reserved for a sales trainer. Not that any job is beneath anybody else and you can't pitch in, but people were starting to get confused to say my title is not matching my job responsibility. So if I were to transfer out into another organization, I'm not equipped to have something on parity with what the industry considers appropriate for the role. So from that perspective, it was, alphabet soup of the murkiest kind, but we had to get those gradations and the role levels just a little bit more neat and clear.
Yeah, and I'll come back to you too, Jamie, on that. So had they tried anything prior to you working with them and coming up with the solutions that you did? Were there other, interventions or kind of solutions that they had tried to implement that hadn't worked or maybe worked partially before you came up with something?
Yes, and I worked with the sponsor. He was a colleague of mine when we were both at AstraZeneca Pharmaceuticals. So he knew kind of my passion. He knew what I had gone on after leaving AstraZeneca to do in my consulting practice. So he was an easy sell. However, what I'm most confused about, and maybe the audience here can help us, is why were the approach that is sought after others fail? At this organization, they had gone through 2 rounds of heavy capabilities investment. So this is HR type service organizations that come in and do capabilities work. So they'll stratify and say, okay, there's customer service, there's account management, there's passion for customers. And what capabilities drive me crazy on is not just the money potential pit that they can be, but it lacks role clarity. If I'm a sales rep or a manager or someone in marketing department, all of those things show up very differently and I need role context for my job. Yet this company invested heavily in competencies in 2019 and then again in 2022. So that's thing number 1. Thing number 2 is they had gone through a restructuring because this department of 20 people had 11 job titles amongst the 20 people. Crazy, right? Up for a challenge? Yes. Like I do triathlons in my spare time. I'm the type,
right.
If there's no challenge, I'm going to seek one out. Well, this was challenging because they were restructuring to align span of control. They didn't want a manager having more than 5 to 6 direct reports. So that was underway when we first partnered. And the third thing was, and what's really catching, I guess, favor among some of our clients is external benchmarking. So there are consultancies and advisories that will benchmark you against whether it's other engineering firms like Therese is working with or other pharmaceuticals. And the problem with that is, first of all, you never feel good when you get the report because you're always behind in some indices, right? They don't feel good. But when you're comparing to an external benchmark and companies' other resources and how they're organized and their company culture, it's not a fair comparison. And yet it's easily $1 million to have a subscription. And I think leaders want satisfaction or curiosity to see how their stack ranked against their peers. Whereas the model that Therese and I espouse looks at benchmarking internally, looking at your best within a role to do that as the surest way to move the performance needle. So external benchmarking, a major reorg in their span of control, and the competencies and capabilities investment were 3 things that we kind of inherited and had to know the landscape, right, of what else was happening in the organization.
Yeah, and interesting, it brings up a point, our webinar just prior to this, I'll link whenever we follow up here, but we talked about data and going off that kind of stuff. So it's interesting that you mentioned the benchmarking thing, because one of the things that we talked about there with Bonnie Beresford, who was fantastic on the data side, was benchmarking or any other kind of data is like you said, another company that you might be being compared to, even though they're doing their best to compare apples to apples, that data sometimes is comparing an organization that's 75% over the age of 50 versus your company, which is 75% under 50. So just that one variable can change so many different things. And so, clearly the benchmarking piece. But again, I'll share a link to that. Great webinar, great conversation with Bonnie. But so Therese, what about you? Had your group done something prior, or that hadn't worked as well as they had hoped?
Well, and I think I had mentioned this a little bit in the beginning, and I will say I was fortunate that they hadn't spent lots of money on the whole capabilities and competency thing. Like I said, it was an ad hoc Excel spreadsheet with some behavior, some software skills, a little bit of everything, just kind of however they were describing the job. So I think in some ways that made it easier for me to pitch my approach. And I had been doing this work with a couple other clients at the exact same time and was able to show some really concrete examples to her. And it was a pretty easy buy-in from there. So they had this spreadsheet, and I think the only other thing that they really were doing was they had hired someone to redo their org chart. So they were in the process of kind of restructuring things. I think the organization was pretty flat and maybe a little bit too flat when you have an engineering department reporting up to a CEO who really didn't have the time to really invest in career development with her team, let alone, my guess is they probably were doing performance reviews once a year and that type of thing because it was simple and easy, and the CEO was stretched probably too thin. So little easier sell on my side and a little less complicated. So I guess I'm a little glad about that after hearing what Jamie was dealing with.
Right.
Because you know what? Because competencies are so ingrained in our organizational culture that people just don't know how to think outside of that box. And it's not really a huge leap from behavior to result, but because it's so ingrained, people just sometimes have a hard time making that shift.
Yeah. So I want to throw a question out to the audience, and just, if you wouldn't mind, just typing in a word or two that what are some of the things that you have tried that haven't done well from the career pathing or anything related to this, where it's like, hey, we went through this before. Maybe it's similar to what Jamie and Therese have mentioned here already, or maybe there's some other things that you've tried, but throw those in, and we'd love to address those as well. So I'll come back to you, Therese. So as you recognize the current situation, you knew what they had done or hadn't done in the past. What does that approach kind of look like as you start to move forward? And one of the questions that did come in was, how do you get started? So if you could kind of integrate that into the answer too, that'd be great.
Okay. So this will be a little bit longer answer because it is the approach, and I want to give it its due. And if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen a little bit, share my screen too.
Great, thanks.
So that I can, let's see. So can you see my outputs here? The list of my outputs? Right. So this was a pretty small department. Like I said, about 10 people. I started working with the CEO and their HR director. And where we started was to identify all the outputs in the engineering department as a whole. So I interviewed just about everyone in the department, maybe not the level ones, I didn't interview them, but everyone else I interviewed to get their thoughts on, what were the routine outputs that they were doing, what were the non-routine. And we came up with this nice list of outputs that everyone then agreed upon that, these are the main things that we do. After that, we used a Miro board, and I had a sticky note for every output. And we first determined what the path was. So what are the paths that we want? So you can see here, support engineer, associate engineer, and we changed some of the names. We did some research on what other organizations were calling these roles to have that continuity in the industry. And so we went from engineer 1, 2, and 3 to a support engineer, associate engineer, senior engineer. and then added these roles and kind of changed what were technical directors to a little bit more blown out extra roles to give some more opportunities for advancement. So what we ended up doing was actually taking each of the sticky notes that were an output and mapping it to the different roles so that we could be deliberate about the progression in difficulty or time spent and so on and so forth. So we started here, we ended up adding these. So the ones that are in white are stretch outputs. So like, let's say I'm an associate engineer and I'm a support engineer and I want to be moving here, you know, or the associate to the senior. What things can I be doing as an associate that's going to get me closer to the senior engineer? So we had some of those options. So there was some deliberate career growth there. And then,
hey, Therese, could you zoom in just a little bit as you're talking, just so I know we don't need to see all the details, but just so that people kind of understand where you're referencing. Thanks.
So, you know, your senior engineer, we've identified all their outputs. The white ones are their specializations. And then it goes off into two paths, either an expert or a technical. So an expert path, those are people who are going to be able to do testimonies and depositions and be a little bit more of a public figure. Takes a little bit different skill set to do that. So we have that path, and then the technical path if they want to be more specialized on the technical side. Also, these sticky notes in the green are ones that through this discussion, we ended up adding some additional outputs that we hadn't originally found in that first set of interviews. So that's what we did there. Once we did that, then I interviewed them again to start to define the performance. So, you know, here we have the outputs. What are the standards? What are the tasks? And starting to gather some of the information that's going to go into their performance profile. I interviewed primarily the exemplary people for that portion of it, and then verified that with managers and senior people. When we got to the behavior influences, or what are the conditions that we want to have for those people to be successful, that's where I interviewed some experts, and then also interviewed some people that were more average, so that I could see that gap. And I was able to, even though it was really not part of the scope of the project, I was able to come up with a list of recommendations on some things that could help them create better conditions for these people to be successful. So we put it all together. This is the role overview. The first page that they're going to get looks similar to a job description, but what is different is at the end here, let's see if I can zoom in. It's not letting me zoom in anymore. So instead of having capabilities or, you know, role responsibilities and things that they can do, here are the quality outputs that they produce. So we have a list of the 4 outputs that this support engineer is going to be able to produce in their role. Then we get to the output sheet. So then each of those 4 outputs, we did a complete sheet for them that has all the performance data that I was just talking about. So we have impact analysis as the output. Here are the standards, here are the tasks, what software equipment do they use, what are the key relationships, so the who and what do they interact with when they're producing this. And then we get into some of the performer characteristics, and then the performance support. And this is, you know, how do we set expectations? How do they get feedback? What are the resources that they need to produce this output? What kind of incentives are in place? And then what skills and knowledge, you know, how do they gain their skills and knowledge? And then once we have these in place, then I had another meeting with the HR director and the CEO to talk about what are the things that we need in place for this career path program. And so we use the 6 boxes model. And if you're not familiar, you can go to 6boxes.com. It's Carl Binder's model that I use for performance analysis, but also I was able to use it to kind of come up with an implementation plan and just determine the things that we needed for the program. So for example, you can see we have performance profiles as a tool that they'll need, but also, manager and coaching tools, career path process. We're also going to develop a promotion criteria checklist that they can use, the manager can use to know when the next person, that person is ready for their promotion. So this just gave us an overall way to see what else do we need for the program to have in place. And then the next step for us then is to start developing these tools for them.
Awesome. And so just so that everybody knows, there's a lot of details in there. And as I said too, we are recording, so you'll be able to go back and reference that. And we will have a fantastic worksheet that you can use after the fact that we'll reference a couple times, but it kind of lays out some of the structure that both Therese and Jamie use whenever they're putting things together like that. So it'll kind of help walk through some of those questions and steps in the process that Therese was just mentioning, and Jamie can mention herself now. So Jamie, how did you guys approach what you were doing?
Very similarly. So we come from similar schools of thought, and I want the pearl here to be that this approach works. We've seen success. It's tried and true. And I know Therese would make herself available. You can find me on LinkedIn. If you want to talk about this to your organization, there's nothing that we love to do more. So I was going to tie in the worksheet. Matt, thank you for doing that. So let's actually just start and unpack. If you guys have a pen nearby, let's make this actionable. This is going to show up on your worksheet, but let's start the rehearsal now so it's repetitive and you get these steps. Both Therese and I take the same 6 steps. Step number 1 is prioritize the most critical job roles in families. You might not need this approach for every role. If there's 2 folks in a role, probably not worth the ROI to do that. So prioritize what roles really are pivotal to the business where you need this extra clarity. Step 2, align on the strategic business goals that these roles impact. So we are all about impact analysis and business outcomes. Not just a role to have a role, but each role exists within an organization to serve a purpose. So what are the business outcomes that each role should create? So you saw Therese develop like 5 to 7 outcomes. We take the same approach because every role, again, exists for a reason. So find those outputs, not capabilities. You'll drive me crazy. And I know Tina on the line, who's a mentor to me in this space, she had her own consulting company for nearly 10 years doing the same approach as well. It's probably rapid firing and adding some comments to the chat. So I welcome that. Step number 3 is map those outcomes. And you can do that across the roles. And I'll show you how we did it for this client example as well, just so you have a compare and contrast. Same methodology, slightly different approach and graphic. 4, develop the standards, skills, and knowledge for each roles. So this is where if you do have competencies, you can weave them in here at this stage, give a head nod to them in that investment for sure, but it's really to what extent, again, are they driving the business outcomes and what skills do you need to really excel in the current role? Step number 5 is stratify by role level. So in our organization, our client organization, we just put it all kind of on sticky notes. So I'll show you that. You use the Miro board, Therese, which is a great tool. I'll show you our stratification, but it makes sense then to compartmentalize what is right-sized for each role so you have a clear line of sight with growth. And the last is create your supporting artifacts. The job description, the hiring guide, your onboarding training, and your performance management tools should all align to what you find. And those are the 6 that you'll see on the sheet that we're going to get to you as a follow-up to our call. So to make this actionable, to make it tangible and real, since some of you are visual learners, I'm going to share my screen. So you let me know when you can see that. Is that popping up?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. So as we looked across some of these roles, we came through, you see on the left-hand side, the training audience, relationships, team culture, the assets they're responsible for developing, etc., and how that varies in depth and breadth and scope as we worked to scale these across the various roles. So I'm, again, happy to talk with you more about this and the actual profiles of performance we've developed for all of these roles. But as a snapshot, this was our role excellence profile cross comparison. So at a glance, new hires could see, okay, I can see the path of how I'm going to have greater impact with each subsequent role. Secondarily, so we did this also at a large retailer, think home improvement, not the orange, but the blue. And when we scaffold everything from a department manager to assistant store manager to then market director of stores, once we get learning and development involved and we curate assets based upon this stratification you just heard Therese and I talk about, then you can take aspiring, high-performing department managers and give them the training almost as if they're assistant store manager. So you close the gap that sometimes I know I faced early in my career, where you're thrown into a new promotion and it's sink or swim and you don't have the tools necessarily to do that. By softening this curve and taking your high potentials, you can actually start to groom them for their new role so that they're almost getting the training as an assistant store manager and repeat that up the chain. So that's the beauty of really linking all of this career pathing very intentionally based upon, again, what the best in a given role do. So here's just a quick snapshot and a takeaway of where this fits, because we're talking about a process that unfortunately isn't more widely adopted, which is why we were both so excited to do this webinar. But in terms of once you do this work of the work and get started, because I know that was one of our questions, then you're able to create these assets. So you have assets for hiring, a job description, and an interview guide. And pending our time, I can come back and show you some tangible examples of those. And for coaching, you have a coaching guide and an action plan. So in your regular employee coaching and development discussions, you're always constantly talking about the benchmark. It makes coaching, if you're a manager of direct reports, almost easier because there's an agreed upon standard that you're trying to move your folks, help and support them achieve. And then training, of course, your onboarding, everything needs to reflect those specific needs to help your employees get there. So hopefully you see that similar approaches, different kind of graphics, but a tried and true measure of really where our clients have excelled now for career pathing.
Awesome, thank you guys. So we did have a couple folks that bumped in, and one of the thoughts that was, past experience was that they realized job descriptions weren't appropriately setting expectations for their employees that were hired in a role. So kind of as you just mentioned there at the end, the onboarding and things like that. And also, which I think was represented by both of you guys, was kind of the challenge of seniorities, but connected to unions. So that might be something we can talk about later, is how exactly that ties in, because I know there's some experience on that side as well. So Therese, would you mind kind of jumping into some of the impact or the results after you went through this with your client, and what came out of that?
So at this point for us, we're still in the midst of this project. So we have wrapped up the performance profiles and have given them those, and they're starting to pilot those and using them to have conversations, which I think is working out really well. But what I see as the biggest impact so far is that they're starting to adopt this as an organizational culture, right? So it's not just, oh, let's do career pathing for the engineers and we're going to use this nice little model and that's great. I was fortunate enough that the PEO that this small company uses also is trained in 6 boxes performance analysis. And so Cynthia, the CEO, was getting it from another direction. So they were dealing with another issue in another part of the organization. And the PEO said, hey, let me tell you about this. And so she was reading articles about performance improvement. And what happened was, I think it started to all connect for her. And I think we talked about implementing a coaching program that's performance-based and training the director and some other people. And I just see it as like the beginning of the blossom of the driving that performance culture, which is what we really want to do. we don't want to have just these isolated projects that get in there. And yeah, those are helpful. But I think the real power of this approach is to have it infiltrate everything that we do. And Jamie's graphic with the training and the onboarding, I mean, that's a testament to how versatile this framework can be. And so once you've defined that performance, it really infiltrates everything the manager is doing, it, whether it's preparing someone for their job or new performance, whether it's improving performance amongst the department, or if it's just growing your employees and through their career development or any other type of employee development opportunities that you want to present. So I think for me, that's been the real joy of this, that it wasn't just a one and done, let's go in there and do that. They've really got the bug now, and they're ready to expand what they're doing around performance and just embracing it. So that's been wonderful.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about the shift,
Right.
the shift from behavior to performance, or behavior to output, or behavior to accomplishment, that kind of thing. And I know Jamie mentioned this morning or earlier about capabilities or competencies, being a four-letter word. So I think that shift is big, I think. And whether, again, you're a small company or a large company, I think having that mentality of thinking performance first and outcomes first and all that before you start thinking about all the things that have to happen in order to get there, I think that makes a big difference. So Jamie, would you mind sharing a little bit about some of the impact of what you guys put in place there?
Absolutely, and amen to performance thinking. I don't know why it's not more widely used, but once clients see it, and I like shift, that's a nicer term than me saying it's like seeing your parents kiss for the first time or a really bad car accident. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I've had clients say, oh, I get this now. I now performance thinking dominates everything, even my personal life. So the beauty of performance analysis, especially using the best within your organization, that it innately and automatically brings a for us, by us mentality. Because it's created, I'm looking at a peer that always goes to Circle of Excellence or is nominated for President's Chair or whatever. It's like they're showing that it's possible within your own culture and with the same tools that you're using. So there is a for us, by us, for the field, from the field fraternity that develops, I think, because you're showing what's possible within your own organization, and that's not the external benchmarking. So it does create, nothing gets us closer to the business. And really, when we interview these exemplars, there's such a humility because we call them unconsciously competent. When you ask them, what makes you so great? They said, what are you talking about? I'm just doing my job. But they think about their job very differently. Their measures of success of what made a good day is very, it's humbling. And when we extract that and make that transferable and transparent to the rest of the organization, light bulbs go off all over the place. That's, because the majority of folks are just looking for little tips and tricks to do better in their job. Because after all, that's all that we want to do. So I think from that perspective, it is unintentionally a retention tactic. So when you're investing in your top performers and attempting to clone them, they sit a little taller. Their feathers plume out a little bit more because you're investing in them. You are taking time to nurture and understand what makes them so great. And just bending their ear a little bit, you'll get some great insights about unintended organizational accelerators and barriers and things that are getting in their way, so that you can continue to improve that and drive performance. So I think that's key. And we started with role clarity. It was amok in this organization. So at the end, we got role clarity. We had 2 people promoted based upon the new structure, and just a sense of feeling heard, that the nepotism, the favoritism of promotion, and that was tenure based, started to wane, because now we're looking at excellence in the role and quantifying what promotions look like. So we were able to check the box on that, meet some great high performers along the way, who really felt invested in and able to give more. So very awesome when that happens, with the performance analysis approach, and we see it time and time again.
That's wonderful. We're coming sort of to the end, so I want to open up to a couple of questions and kind of address some of the things that came up, but also I want to put out to the group is if there's something that you came in and you had questions about and didn't get answered or didn't come up in our conversation, throw that in there. And at the same time, I'd love to hear maybe some ideas about some takeaways that you heard today and that you want to share. So if you wouldn't mind throwing some of those in the chat. The one thing that I would maybe ask each of you to answer is specific to unions and or other scenarios where there are things in place that may restrict or challenge you for this type of stuff. So Jamie, would you mind starting if you've dealt with that in the past or have any suggestions in that kind of arena?
I haven't dealt with unions per se, but we have done a lot of work with US Coast Guard and other similarly highly regulated industries. So it's understanding the problem. It's always aligning with senior stakeholders first and understanding what's possible within the confines. But the process works. It's nearly bulletproof and has started with a very short lineage of which, Therese and I are one branch of the tree, but no specific union experience. And I won't make any up.
Yeah.
Maybe Therese has.
Yeah.
So we did have one client that we used this approach with, that we were dealing with a union. Now, we didn't have to have any direct relationship with the union. We were working with the director of the service department for a local municipality, but the approach worked. So when we went in and pitched the idea that, hey, we want to look at not just the behaviors and their responsibilities, we want to define the outputs. The fact that it was performance-based and it was able to differentiate the levels was wonderful. What they had were a bunch of, in their service department, everyone had the same title. And so what they wanted to do was kind of come up with these classifications for the different areas in their department and then have 3 levels. So they would have a tech 1, a tech 2, and a lead. And so we basically went through the same process of just identifying all the outputs and then kind of stratifying them to each role, and then created some evaluations for them and ways for them to take these people that were already, just in one role, and how do we now move those people into different roles. They had a really easy tool to do that by evaluating each of their work outputs by the standards.
Gotcha, thank you. So one just to come in, and the question is how to empower employees to think creatively and bring ideas for the role expansion rather than simply asking for a promotion based on tenure. So any ideas around getting the involvement in the process? So it's not just you and or the managers telling them what's happening versus, kind of bringing them into the fold and coming to them with ideas and suggestions.
So the question is empowering, having that conversation, not just saying and iterating out, I'm worthy of a promotion, but I think now post-pandemic, employees are far more empowered than they ever have been because the ball's in their court. We're hearing about the quiet quitting. We know about folks just, and the great retention and everything that's at play. So I'm happy to talk offline, but I think just understanding, okay, these are my aspirations. Are you having those one-on-one conversations with your manager? Much to my frustration, some of our clients are still having those conversations annually. But to have someone that's invested in you, whether it's a mentor, whether it's that regular coaching, to say, I aspire to do this next level role. Help me understand what is required for that. So maybe I'm getting hung up on the empowerment question, but making your intentions known and kind of understanding what that looks like for your career journey, or getting help on mapping what the next career step would be logically, is a great place to start. So if there's any bit of frustration or apathy or languishing in your current role, then you owe it to yourself to say, okay, what is it that I'd really like to do? How am I going to enroll my manager's support in doing that? Do we have a coaching culture even where that's possible, to kind of ask about that? And sometimes it's not a career ladder, right? It's that lattice and saying, okay, could I do a secondment? Could I do a sabbatical? Could I fill in for someone on maternity leave? There's tons of options where you can gain deep experience that don't require a longer term commitment. So I hope that.
Yeah, and I think too, and I'll let Therese jump in as well. I think one of the things, so we just shared an article on improving performance at work.com. So if you're interested, you can check that out. But it is, the title is something to the effect of, our annual performance reviews, sabotaging your workplace. And it's what you just said. I think we're so used to once a year, we get together, we talk about the good and the bad, and you get a raise or you don't, or whatever it is, or promotion. And so I think that idea of whether it's quarterly or monthly or weekly or whatever works for you, I think it does come back to that relative to the manager or the HR person or whatever that is connected into that mentoring role for that employee, to try to allow them to feel empowered, to give them the ability to come and be creative with that. So just a plug for the site, you can go grab that on the website. Therese, any thoughts on the kind of employee creativity and kind of bringing some of that out of them to be involved in the conversation?
Yeah, I think just the nature of the way we present the job role makes it a little more inherently easy for managers and employees to have conversations about the work that they're doing. I know if you're using that as a coaching tool, you could easily say, if the employee and the manager are looking at the same document, you can say, how can we establish better relationships, or how can we work on, how confident you are, meeting these standards better. I think just getting employees to think differently about their role, instead of having what we have this job description. I mean, I have a job description for my role, but do I know where it is, or what it is, or what it even says at this point? So I think being a little bit more connected to the work that we do, I think will help people be a little bit more creative. I know it's helped for me with my department, having these coaching conversations, and people start to think about it differently, like, oh, I could do this, or they're looking at what they do as outputs and ways to be better at doing that. So I think just the nature of the tools that we have provided make it easier to have those kind of questions and get people thinking differently about the work they do.
I think Jimmy mentioned culture too. I think making it a culture and such that encourages those additional thoughts and comments and feedback from the employee without feeling like they will be questioned or shot down or anything like that, but giving them an opportunity. So, well, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate the conversation today. I think we had some good dialogue, and again, this is all recorded, and so we will be sharing this out with everybody as well. It's I think the shift that we talked about, hopefully that is something that everybody's walking away with, is a shift in what they think about and how they think about career path and career path design. Like I said, we have this recording. We will be sharing that out with everybody. We also have another great webinar coming up in April that we'll be sending out registrations here soon. It's called How to Create a Highly Connected, Highly Engaged, and Winning Team. So that's coming up on Wednesday, April 12th. So we're excited to have that as well. If you have any questions, as Jamie mentioned and Therese mentioned, very happy to talk to you guys. You can reach out to us at improvingperformanceatwork.com, and we will certainly be sure to connect you with these two wonderful ladies and their brains. So thanks again for you guys coming today, and thanks for everybody for attending today.